Hi everyone, today our hot topic is work capacity. And work capacity and conditioning are rather interchangeable. So we're going to sort of start by defining conditioning, borrowing from Coach Joel Jameson. And just to read off the slide here, I'm going to say that conditioning is a measure of how well an athlete is able to meet the energy production demands of their sport. A football player who is able to generate tremendous power for 10 to 12 seconds each play over the course of an entire game is just as well conditioned as a fighter who can last all 5 rounds of a championship fight, for example. Conditioning is about much more than just cardio. So let's keep in mind that our conditioning or work capacity, and those terms are very interchangeable. Conditioning, a lot of times people think about just kind of your rote cardiovascular endurance, your ability to maybe run a 5K or a half marathon or as little as 1 mile. So let's keep in mind that that's not applicable to everybody. So for our purposes, conditioning or work capacity is going to be related or relevant to the athlete's needs analysis, or sort of what their position or their sport actually requires. And I would just to kind of plug Coach Joel Jameson. If anybody wants to dive in deeper, I would highly recommend Ultimate MMA Conditioning by Joel Jameson. That's the fighter Rich Franklin on the front there. But just an excellent coach, very smart, and does a great job of breaking down complex matters in his book that even I can understand. So I would challenge anyone or encourage anyone who wants to kind of up their game with conditioning or work capacity or cardio or anything like that to go check out this book. And if you check out his website, which is 8weeksout.com, this book is rather old now, but he's since put out some new programs and some online learning and other options like that. When it comes to conditioning, different sports have different demands. And if we look at the chart, we're able to sort of separate and break down some different duration of events and the energy systems that they're going to utilize and depend on. So if we have a thrower for track and field, we know that their events are going to last less than 6 seconds. The intensity is extremely high. There's not too many variables. They're going to spin a couple of times around and throw something as far as they can. And that primary energy system is going to be phosphagen. And I'm not going to read out the chart, every square of the chart there. But take a look, though. As we move from phosphagen, we then switch into fast glycolysis, and then the oxidative system. And so we have essentially 3 different energy systems that we're looking to feed off of or train or measure so that we know that our training is working or not. So not every sport is as clear cut as maybe that track and field thrower. Maybe a rugby player scores a certain amount of tries against one team, but against another team, they do not. So is that because their physical performance has improved or decreased, or does the other team have better defense? So when you start piling in factors like that, you can't really tell how the physical performance is. So that's why some testing off the sport field and in the weight room might give us a better look or indicator to how that athlete's body is reacting to training. And just to give you an example, take a couple of American athletes. Deanna Price, at 5'8" and 240 pounds, is a world champion in the hammer throw. And I'm not going to butcher Maria's last name there, but she's 5'5", 115 pounds, And she's a high-level race walker and even ended up winning the 2016 time trials for the Olympic time trials. So didn't win gold in the main event, but in qualifying she won. So if you just take a look there, no, they're not too different in height. There's a 3-inch difference there. But Deanna is twice as heavy as Maria. And do you think that they train the same or that they have the same energy demands? Not at all. They are different ends of the spectrum for athletes. So keep that in mind, is that conditioning, what does conditioning or work capacity mean for each of those different athletes? Well, basically totally different things. They are sort of opposites there. And I'm not going to read through this here, but I wanted to provide you all with a little bit of a resource or a reminder on some of the nitty-gritty details behind that phosphagen system. So if you're interested, pause it now and read through it. And again, who uses that phosphagen system? That 6 seconds and less duration. Yeah, it's involved in the beginning of every sprint. A baseball player, swinging their bat or throwing the ball, a golfer striking the ball, or a weightlifter, ripping that weight up off the floor and eventually hopefully getting it over their head. And again, as we get into the next energy system, I'm not going to read through this, but if you're interested, pause now and do maybe some review or some new learning on it. And who uses that second energy system, that glycolytic system? Well, athletes who are training are being challenged between 30 seconds and 2 minutes. So certain track athletes, like maybe the 400 event for men, and perhaps speed skaters, events in the pool. Looks like there's some type of track race on the bikes there. But again, even our long distance athletes are probably going to transition from that phosphagen system in the first 6 seconds of a high effort into the glycolytic system in that 30-second window to the 2-minute marker, if they have a high intensity of effort in the beginning of maybe a longer event. And that third energy system is going to be oxidative, fat oxidation. And we're kind of looking at this chart here. We're sort of switching our names or our titles for it. I think part of that is that I believe this chart is a little bit more derived from Europe, so I think there's just some different schools of thought there. But what this does is basically gives us a better idea of a needs analysis for different sports, right? So we've got an aerobic dancer up on the top level here. They're at 5% phosphagen or ATP PC, and 15 to 20 for anaerobic glycolytic, and then 75 to 80 for aerobic or oxidation. So where would you spend the majority of your time training? This is the lowest number. That's not it. And then that's got the least, that's the second least. And then this is the most. So when you're setting up your training programs, you want to spend most of your time training in the energy system window that is related to your athlete's needs. And the same thing goes for testing. So let's see, if we've got a golfer, let's see, they've got 95% ATP PCR or phosphagen. They've got 5% anaerobic glycolytic, and they have 0 aerobic. So if I've got a golf team or a golf athlete, would I test a 6-minute run or a 10-minute run? Would that be a high priority for me? Probably not. Now, if I want to make the argument that I'm concerned about their health, or there might be some extraneous factors involved, but for their sport performance, not really relevant. So where would you spend most of your time training? Clearly not in the aerobic block or oxidative, not in our anaerobic glycolytic or glycolysis. But we're gonna basically live and breathe in that ATP PCR or phosphagen window. So we want to spend time in we want to spend our time valuably. A chart like this sort of breaks it down and just makes it a little bit easier to see maybe where you need to be stressing and emphasizing. And then I really like looking at that skiing one there, because for skiing, it appears to be a 3-way tie. So how would you decide where to spend most of your time? Well, for starters, you'd probably spend about a third of your time in each window there. And then if you were able to test and measure different individuals, you could probably create some sort of hierarchy for where they are strongest and weakest. And then you would have to decide, if I have an athlete who's really, really strong in the aerobic energy system, do I want to give that up and spend more time in maybe their weakest link over here? Or do I want to kind of double down on it and make sure that this is the best aerobically trained skier in the league or tournament or world or whatever? So then you have to start making some of those decisions, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to give up your strengths just to shore up your weaknesses. You want to maintain strengths and build up weaknesses at the same time. So then you're talking about sort of that art of coaching and some different philosophies, and you might have to talk to a handful of experts in that specific sport. So things get complicated quickly. Let's look at some different muscle fiber types. Type 1 would be our slow twitch. I think more like a sort of a born for marathon running, such as like a Kenyan. And also we have different batches and ratios of different types of muscle fibers, even throughout our bodies. So our heart does not have skeletal muscle. It has cardiac muscle. So it's a little bit of a different format, but it's going to be a little bit more like a slow twitch muscle fiber. And then for fast twitch muscle fibers, think about like a Jamaican. Our Jamaicans, when we watch the Olympics, the 100 meter dash is often dominated not only by a single Jamaican, but the field is often pretty rich in Jamaicans. They always represent and do pretty well in the sprint events. And if you look at our quadriceps, tend to be a little bit higher in that type 2A muscle fiber type. And again, we've got a blend of these muscle fibers in our skeletal muscles. A lot of our skeletal muscles have a blend of type 1, type 2A, and type 2B. And different individuals, different pools of genetics sort of have a preference or a prominence of one or the other. And then that type 2B is a muscle fiber that is going to be, So let's back it up there. I was running my mouth in the wrong direction there. So type 2A is going to be sort of our transition muscle fiber, whereas type 2B is going to be our fast. So pardon me, we'll call type 1 slow. Call type 2B fast, and we call type 2A our transition. So excuse my mistake there. But with type 2A, when we train that transition muscle fiber, that's where we can change, we can mutate some of the strengths and weaknesses of that muscle fiber. So if we do a lot of endurance work, a lot of long distance running or swimming or biking, let's say we're on a triathlon kick and we spend 15 hours a week doing slow and steady cardio, those type 2A muscle fibers are probably going to start resembling the type 1 muscle fiber by increasing resistance to fatigue. The force production is probably going to decrease just a little bit. The number of mitochondria is probably going to increase. Number of capillaries is probably going to increase. Myoglobin content is probably going to increase. And oxidative capacity will also probably increase. So those muscle fibers they will actually start to look and act like a type 1 fiber. But let's say we finish that triathlon and maybe we want to start doing, we've got spring break coming up and we want to start doing like heavy lifting and bodybuilding workouts and maybe do some like powerlifting and heavy strength training. And we're sprinting as well. So maybe we're doing all these things that are really picking on our type 2 muscle fibers, type 2B muscle fibers, our fast twitch muscle fibers. Well, our type 2A, our transition muscle fibers, are going to start to behave and look like our type 2B muscle fibers. So keep in mind that those muscle fibers have different actions and they mutate along with our training. So we know our skeletal muscles will change, but within our cardiovascular system, our heart will change as well. So if you're doing a lot of sprint work, a lot of anaerobic work, sprinting, heavy lifting, that actually may thicken the wall of the left ventricle. And for some individuals, this can end up creating a health concern. It's rare, but it happens. So there can be a lot of benefits to maybe not always doing sprints and heavy lifting, but actually incorporating some aerobic work in as well. Now, aerobic exercise will also mutate the heart a little bit. It'll actually grow the volume of the left ventricle. So if you look over here, so aerobic, we get left ventricle, eccentric left ventricle hypertrophy. So that eccentric effect from aerobic exercise actually causes that muscular wall on the heart to lengthen and distend in a good way so that more blood can rush in and then be pumped out. So it increases the stroke volume in your heart. And then with resistance exercise, with that concentric left ventricle, that was a terrible highlight there. Sorry about that, people. With that concentric hypertrophy, what we're actually doing is we're training that wall of that heart to shorten over time, and it'll start to thicken up as well. So there we go. I'll start highlighting with that thing. So that's something to watch out for and be aware of, is that although training specifically for strength and speed may benefit performance, it may also cause some heart problems in the long run. So to incorporate some aerobic exercise to sort of balance that out may be wise, especially if there's like a family history of heart issues. And something else that changes in our body would be the blood vessels, our vascular system. With regular aerobic conditioning, we reduce blood pressure, and blood vessels are better able to dilate and allow for better blood flow. We're also going to have a genesis or creation of more capillaries. So the blood that's already flowing is going to be able to transfer nutrients and gases into the tissues as it travels around. So yeah, another mutation from aerobic conditioning. And our blood volume with regular aerobic conditioning, our blood volume is going to go up as well. And with increased blood volume, we're automatically sort of better hydrating the body. Our heart doesn't have to work as hard. So instead of sort of like a gross little like muddy river flowing of blood flowing into the heart, and then the heart maybe not even filling up all the way on each beat. It's like a rushing, roaring river of blood that goes into the heart, fills it up to the brim, and then the heart pumps and keeps the process going. So it makes, let's see here. So the increased blood volume decreases your heart rate. So it'll decrease your heart rate. And then that preload, that cardiac preload, every time the heart is done beating and it's relaxing, blood just rushes in and does a better job of refilling it. So it's less stress on the heart. So let's look at 5 conditioning styles. Long, slow distance. And this is probably this is sort of typical of what we think of when we think of conditioning, is that maybe you strap on your tennis shoes and you go out on the street and you run 30 minutes in one direction, and then you turn around and you run 30 minutes back. And this has its benefits. Good for our cardiovascular health. Good for sort of building a base of conditioning. But again, if we look back and think back to our earlier slides with Coach Joel Jamieson's definition of conditioning, what does long, slow distance condition athletes to do? Basically, it conditions them to go out on the street and run for 30 minutes in one direction and then turn around and come back. So this is much more appropriate for a long distance athlete than it is for many other athletes. This does not mean that other athletes will not benefit, but it does mean that they may benefit more in regards to their performance if they're training in other more closely related styles of conditioning. So moving on to tempo training, this is going to be a little bit more intense, looking at that 85% max heart rate. So it's going to be a little bit more intense than our long, slow distance work. But essentially what you're doing is you're just keeping it a little bit more succinct, and you're giving yourself a 20 to 30 minute window in which you go out and challenge yourself. Moving on to interval work. Now that heart rate is getting up to 95% of your max heart rate, and that duration is going to shrink again. So as intensity goes up, volume goes down, just like in the weight room, just like with our strength training, intensity and volume have an inverse relationship. So with intervals, again, 95% of max heart rate, and your length is going to be 30 seconds to 5 minutes. And now you're going to start incorporating a work to rest ratio. So now you're going to start using, instead of just a single go of conditioning, you will actually get to rest and recover, and you're going to perform sets and reps. So it's starting to look a little bit more like some of our weight room training. That's because the intensity is going to get so high that we're going to start to drift down, maybe away from that oxidative system and more into our glycolysis and our phosphagen systems. And that's going to start to be a little bit more similar to our strength training. And the appropriate work to rest ratio for intervals is going to be around 1:1 or 1:3. If you're waiting much longer than that, then the interval may not be hard enough to cause the stimulus that we want. And then kicking up again, we're going to go to repetition. So again, the intensity is changing. And as it gets more intense, the volume drops again. Now we're in 30 seconds to 90 seconds in length. And that work to rest ratio is going to increase. We want a lot of rest because when we go in to do our set or our rep, that heart rate is at 97% and above. You're basically redlining. So you need plenty of rest. So that's why that work to rest ratio is so generous. And then fartlek. Fartlek is a Swedish term that means speed play. And with fartlek training, you can utilize fartlek for basically any of the styles you want. It can be a recovery day, it could be a competition day, and what you may sort of intelligently design it with some goals in mind. So maybe normally you're pretty robotic about your conditioning style and your conditioning training, and normally you follow this chart and everything is really timed out well. But sometimes, a stimulus can only be provided for so long until people they grow numb to it and it's no longer stimulating. So let's say we incorporate fartlek and we want to be creative and we want to be fun and we want to get maybe a really crazy hard workout in, or try to get our athletes to do something they've never done before. So let's say maybe we've been doing tempo training and we've been doing intervals and we've been doing a little bit of everything on the chart, but we haven't been doing anything in like that 10-minute window. So we could maybe incorporate something like this, fartlek, and maybe you tell your athletes what it is, or maybe you don't. So for fartlek, maybe you just call it like a 10-10-10. So you could just speed play something that you're not, there's nothing really that crazy about a 10-minute warm-up into a 10-minute high effort, into a 10-minute recovery, into another 10-minute. So we do 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes. So what we've essentially done is we've just gone to a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio for an unusual amount of time that maybe we're not training. There's nothing special or magical about that, except for that it would be different. It would be a new stimulus, and it's new stimuluses that cause new adaptations. Stimuluses, I guess it's stimuli, but so that's not very creative or fun or wacky or anything. But if it's different, we might be onto something. But speed play can actually be more like play. So we could also play, maybe instead of doing a repetition day, maybe they show up and you have them play like a game of ultimate frisbee or a game of tag or something like that. So you could put a game. It's gonna mimic maybe some of those similar energy systems. Now, if you have track athletes who are excellent moving linearly, they run fast forward very well, but they don't do a lot of change of direction or cutting, then that game may actually be a little bit more risky, might be a little bit more dangerous. But if you have field athletes or court athletes who they sort of live and die by their cutting and change of direction anyways, that game, it may not be too different to cause some issues. And then what you could do finally is you could basically be rolling a dice, and you could say every other number that we hit is going to be the next section of either work or rest. So rolling the dice, let's say you hit 6, 2, 5, 1, 1, 1, 3. So what we would do there is we would work, rest, work, rest, work, rest, work, or vice versa. And what you would end up getting are some interesting highs and lows and a stimulus of fatigue and exhaustion that you're not getting in a normal pre-planned training session. So that can be good if you check it and regulate a little bit. It can also be trouble if you, it can also be kind of a wasted day if things aren't going right. So maybe you roll the dice, but you step in a little bit with some of the knowledge that you have. So speed play, that's fartlek. That's the fartlek style of conditioning, and it's speed play. So those are the training styles. And when I think about that long, slow distance, just maybe think about Forrest Gump running back and forth across the country a few times. It's just people going out and getting in some road work, or they could be swimming or biking. Maybe they're power walking in the mall on a Sunday morning. But it's just getting your heart rate up to about 80% and keep moving. So it's a pace that you feel like you could basically do all day. Or maybe not all day, but you feel like you could do it for that 30-minute to 2-hour duration without maybe it being the hardest thing that you've done in your life. It's just some good, steady work. And again, that's not super sport specific, but it has lots of benefits. So it's not to be discounted, but keep in mind what it's actually training and what it's actually doing to your heart, to your energy systems, to your muscle fibers. So looking at tempo training, I think of my first car that I ever owned was a 1991 Ford Tempo. That's not an exact picture of my car, but that is the same beautiful model of it. And one thing that I remembered from it is that at age 16, this was not like a road racing car at all, but my speedometer actually topped out at 85 miles per hour. And I just like that it's 85 miles per hour on the speedometer of a Ford Tempo, and also it's 85% and above for max heart rate of tempo training. And keep in mind that tempo training is going to be sort of a single blast of effort, 20 to 30 minutes in duration. But that intensity is a little bit higher. Now we're getting a little bit more sport specific. Interval training. So work to rest ratio. So I sort of think you can definitely do this on flat ground, but I sort of think about maybe like running up a flight of stairs and then taking an elevator down. So you work your butt off on the way up, and then you just relax in the elevator and listen to a little bit of music on the way down and catch your breath, and you go again. That repetition training, again, the intensity goes up, the volume goes down, getting a little bit more sport specific. But now that rest time is getting so long, you might want to look at your sport if you're actually getting that kind of rest time or not. So a ratio of 1 to 5 is pretty aggressive. So it actually may be unrelated to your sport on the fast side, whereas that continuous long slow running is unrelated on the slow side and the long side. Now we're starting to get it so aggressive that we might be surpassing and changing away from our sport specificity on the fast side. And then with fartlek training, it varies. We dove into that a little bit, and honestly, you can determine it based on using a deck of cards and assigning different values to the cards and to your work and rest ratios, and maybe to even what movement you're doing. Or you can just roll dice, or you can just put your brain to work and just look at maybe some of the training that you've been doing for the last couple months, and just say, okay, it's time to do something unusual. And maybe I want that unusual day to be a hard day, or maybe I want it to be a recovery day, and you can go from there. So we know that there's training styles, and then we can look at how to develop that work capacity. and we have options there. So let's look at our cardiac output method. And that's basically going to be your long, slow distance work. It can be running, biking, rowing, swimming, Stairmaster, recline bike, whatever it is. But again, that's sort of just the 30 to 90 minutes of slow and steady. And looking at that heart rate there, not everybody's always going to have a heart rate monitor. So keep in mind that we have options there. We don't have to slap a heart rate on because of studies that have been done. We know about the scale of 6 to 20. And we basically say that 6 is your resting heart rate and 20 is your max heart rate. And when you use that as a scale, it sort of leads into almost matching your heart rate. So instead of a 6, if you just put a 0 after that at 60, that's probably pretty close to most of our heart rates. And instead of a 20 for the max, if we put a 0 at the end of that for 200, that's probably pretty close to some of our max training heart rates as well. So even though we may not have a heart rate monitor, we might just use a simple scale such as that. So moving on to cardiac power intervals. So this is going to benefit our cardiac strength. So it's going to make our heart stronger. And it's going to increase the mitochondria in our cardiac tissue. And the guidelines would be 60 to 120 seconds or reps. It's high velocity. You're attempting to get to reach a maximum heart rate. And then you're going to rest for 2 to 5 minutes and let that heart rate return and drop down to about 120 to 130. And you can see the volume that you would perform per session is 4 to 12. And also there's a suggestion or a guideline on how many times to use it per week. And this chart is borrowed directly from Joel Jamieson's book, Ultimate MMA Conditioning, which we already talked about earlier. Our tempo method is going to boost our slow twitch fibers, hypertrophy, and it's going to increase the mitochondria in our muscles. And this is a little bit of a different tempo method, whereas we were talking about our other tempo there that was a little bit more to do with some basic cardio style of your choosing. And now we're talking about actually utilizing strength training to get our aerobic work in. And so it says 4 to 5 seconds per rep. So you're probably going to spend about 2.5 seconds on the way down and about 2.5 seconds on the way up for each rep. 8 to 10 reps per set. No resting or pausing and constant breathing. And then between sets, you're going to take 30 to 40 seconds. And then between exercises, you're going to take about 6 to 8 minutes of active recovery. So that might be walking around. That might be dropping down on the ground and doing some extra abs. The volume is going to be 3 to 5 sets per exercise and 3 to 4 exercises per workout. And our last style would be high intensity cardiovascular training. And this is basically, imagine getting on a sort of a reclined stationary bicycle and cranking up the resistance on it and just riding at a slow RPM of about 20 to 30 RPM per minute. And that heart rate is going to go up to about 150 to 160. And the benefit here is that you're going to get some like skeletal muscle damage and challenge there. And it's a different type of stimulus. It's going to, our benefits there are to increase oxidative abilities of fast twitch muscle fibers and to increase mitochondria in the muscle. And at 10 to 20 minutes per set, whatever movement you're doing, those muscles will be will be challenged along with your cardiovascular system. So it sort of takes a step back away from just being cardio and starts to challenge and incorporate those type 2 muscle fibers. So test it and best it. How would we test? What would we test? We can test distance for time, which is often done with maybe a half mile, 1 mile, a 2 mile or more. We can do time for distance. So Cooper's test would be from the Cooper Institute. It's a 12-minute run. See how far you go, and then you can improve it from there. And then a similar time for distance test is the maximum average speed test, which you can do with different times, but 6 minutes is a pretty common protocol. And we're going to revisit that MAS testing and how to utilize that, not only for testing, but for training prescription. So we have another discussion on that coming up in a handful of videos here. And you can also do, it's the same idea. It's a 20-minute go-go run. So 20 minutes, how far can you go? VO2 max test. You can do predictive tests, or like that image in the lower right, you could do sort of a laboratory setting where they're measuring your ability to utilize oxygen and buffer lactic acid. So if you have the resources, you can do the real thing with the laboratory testing, or there are some fairly accurate predictive tests as well. Some step-up challenges, some treadmill protocols, beep tests. Now the beep test is probably where we are getting sport specific. And this is one that more and more teams are starting to realize that maybe the 1 mile test for a basketball team or a soccer team, maybe that's not the best indicator. It's an indicator, but is it the best indicator? Maybe not. Maybe a better key performance indicator would be the beep test. And if you look in that image in the lower left with those two cartoon gals running around, what they're doing is they're starting behind one cone, and that boom box is going to give them like a single beep, and that's the warning. And then the next beep is the go. And they have a certain amount of time to run past the next cone before a third beep goes off. And then they're going to stay down there, and then they're going to wait for another warning beep, and then a go beep, and then a third cutoff beep. And they're going to keep going, and the rest times are going to shrink, and the running times are going to shrink, and it's going to get harder and harder. And then they'll measure basically how well they are performing with a repeated sprint ability. So that repeated sprint ability, and now all of a sudden we're looking a lot more like what happens in basketball games, what happens on a soccer field, what happens on a lacrosse field. So now we're getting a lot better idea of how well can this individual or this athlete put forth an effort, take a little bit of rest, and then put forth an effort again. And also there's a hair of change of direction involved, but that's not the priority or the principal test. So that beep test, something to check out. And then two more pretty quick and easy tests would be the resting heart rate. When an individual has been relaxing for a few minutes, how low can they get their heart rate? The stronger and healthier that heart is, the better that heart rate is going to, or the lower that heart rate is going to be. This is not a 100% accurate predictor. You could have someone who's not in great shape that has a low heart rate, but it is a good indicator, and it's also super easy to test. And then heart rate recovery would be taking an individual to basically like a maximum heart rate of close to 200, or taking them up to the point that their heart rate is plateauing, and then letting them recover and measuring the time it takes for their heart rate to get down to maybe 120, maybe 130, something like that. So there's some variations of that test as well. But also really easy to test. Doesn't take a lot of space, room, or time. Remember, just like our strength training, our work capacity training, is going to affect the body in a similar way. You got stimulus and adaptation. So bringing in the new type of training, whatever it is, probably going to cause this alarm phase. Now, if we're training intelligently, we can probably send them up to the resistance phase for a little while, getting some positive super compensation, some adaptation. But if we're not being careful, if we're not being intelligent about it, eventually we will send them into an exhaustion phase. Now, because strength training and heavy lifting, which is a lot of what we've talked about already, is so stressful in a certain way, it tends to go through this process faster than our work capacity training does or our conditioning. So again, be thinking about how we can condition athletes into that super compensation spot and then back off and maybe begin the cycle again without falling into negative adaptation. How can we provide that stimulus without underdoing it or overdoing it? And just a reminder about how Coach Joe Ken, sort of talks about some training cycles. You know, we talked about the mesocycle that was 4 weeks in length with 4 microcycles in each, each being 1 week in length. Well, there's a few reasons why our conditioning or work capacity cycles might come in 8-week blocks. Now, one of those is that, again, conditioning and work capacity tends to be less stressful than strength training and resistance training. So now going out for a run might be more exhausting than lifting, but it's less stressful on your nervous system. It has less damage to your hormones. So when we're doing running and work and conditioning, we get less trauma to the joints, less trauma to the muscles, less trauma to the central nervous system. So that lengthens and that gives us a bigger window within which we can train. And I'll also point out that Coach Joel Jameson recommends 8-week blocks for some of the same logic. And while Christopher McDougall is not necessarily a exercise physiologist or an exercise scientist, if you ever get the chance to read Born to Run, it makes a great argument for why human beings have a pretty high capacity or potential to grow our ability to run. And it doesn't necessarily have to be running, but whatever conditioning you're doing, I would just say is that there's some great rationale for why you may not cut yourself short into a 4-week mesocycle, why you may be able to, drag it out a little bit longer and train longer. But if we need to keep it simple, or if there's some reason why we might need to have a shorter training cycle, think about that intensity and volume relationship. With a shorter volume, you would then maybe crank up the intensity just a little bit. And I would recommend, with conditioning or work capacity, changing about 1 factor per progression. And so when it comes to rest, in sort of a base week, you might have however much rest you have, and then you can decrease it as time goes on. As you're trying to make the training more intense, you could simply just decrease the rest that's available. Or you can increase the intensity or increase the volume. For progressive workouts, I would not necessarily change multiple factors at once. Usually just changing 1 factor sort of nurtures better adaptation to the previous week's stimulus of training. Okay, we're running a little short on time, so I'm just going to blast through one or two examples here. So let's say it's cardiac output method, and we want to keep our heart rate between 120 and 150, and it says 30 to 90 minutes, and it says 1 to 3 sessions per week. So what can we do for week 1? Well, maybe we just give ourselves that heart rate window. We don't pick a specific heart rate because that can sometimes be more trouble than it's worth. But let's say we go for a 45-minute run. And week 1, we just do it once per week. And then week 2, we do it 2 times in that week. And then week 3, we do it 3 times per week. And then in week 4, what could we do? Well, we could go from 45 minutes to maybe 60 minutes. And if you want, now maybe you try to do that 3 times a week, or maybe you rotate back down and go to once per week. And that's going to be a little bit different based on what other factors are happening and that sort of art and science and what you feel is appropriate. But going from 3 45-minute runs to 1 60-minute run, probably not that stressful. So with a smaller jump like 15 minutes, maybe keeping the 3 sessions per week would be okay. And then the following week you go to 3 70-minute runs, and then you can kind of work your way up to 3 90-minute runs per week. And that's probably going to take you the course of about 7 or 8 weeks. And that's basically kind of right in our sweet spot. Let's see, what else could we do? So let's say we come down, we do some HICT. All right, so let's say we do a 10-minute ride on our stationary bike with our max resistance, low speed, all that good stuff. But what could we do? We could start with a 10-minute rest in between 3 sets per workout, and we could go from that 10-minute rest. And each week for the next 5 weeks, we could take 1 minute of rest off and just proceed like that. So we're just changing one factor. Now you don't always have to change the same factor over and over again. You can maybe we would work our way down to 5 minutes of rest, and then we would start to build the length of the set. So those are just some ideas to play around with. Obviously, we could go on forever, talking about that, but although we spent so much time emphasizing and discussing all the options we had for our strength training or our resistance training, we're not spending as much time talking about our conditioning training, because so many of the principles that apply to resistance training are going to apply to our conditioning training. And I just want to finish on a little tangent here and bring up Courtney DeWalter. So Courtney DeWalter runs ultra marathons. And this endurance sport is pretty interesting, because now we're getting to a point that women are in a position to just beat men flat out. So no differences in start times or anything like that. Just an even level playing field, and women are able to surpass men. So not that there's not plenty of women who can lift heavier weights than I can or run faster than I can, but that's just not too common in the elite sporting world. So some reasons that might be is the increased pain tolerance, maybe something that nature gave them for birthing children. Maybe that their heart to body weight ratio gives them a little bit of an advantage when they're 24 hours into a race, and it's you're basically just sitting on an elevated heart rate for that period of time, and maybe having a naturally lighter body is a benefit. But either way, as long as we're talking about this work capacity and conditioning, I wanted to bring that up. And I also wanted to bring up maybe two other things that we should consider when training females would be the propensity for ACL tears and the importance of VMO work to help prevent that. So with women having wider hips naturally to assist with childbirth, then this creates what is known as a Q angle at the knee. And due to that Q angle, our female athletes are at higher risk for ACL tears. And another thing that I do in training men differently from women is Coach Mark Ripito writes about, he encourages the addition of negatives and eccentric reps for female lifters. His logic is the lower testosterone levels in women, which men have somewhere around 20 times more testosterone naturally. The lower testosterone levels in women lead to decreased stress in their ability to produce concentric force. And because they're producing so much less concentric force, there's a lot of basically meat left on the bone or room for potential growth with the use of negatives and eccentrics. And because men and women's nervous systems are fairly similar, but their skeletal muscular systems are not so similar, using eccentrics on females, whereas think about a pull-up, so maybe they can no longer do a pull-up, or maybe they can't do a single pull-up, and you have them climb up and then lower themselves down under control. So that would be sort of a negative or an eccentric. But female athletes sort of seem to respond better to this. They'll train harder on it, based on that pain tolerance, and also they are able to sort of, due to kind of bumming or borrowing Mark Ripito's theory of testosterone and concentric strength, because they have that, they're handling less weight overall typically. Those eccentrics do not kind of bite into them and cause severe CNS distress or anything like that. And then my final note is just that Courtney's actually running downhill right here. And she says that that's one of her big benefits or advantages over men, is that if they run down a hill like that, their inability to handle the negative, the eccentric stress on the quad and their higher body weights, and possibly, I'm kind of ad-libbing here, but maybe it's also their pain tolerance is not as high, but she's able to run down hills, and a lot of the male competitors are not able to. So just a tangent on a few things that I thought were interesting, and that is it. We'll see you guys.